Seeing none. Item 6.
Item 6, Community Service Organization Report. 6A, Urban Wildlife Management Report. Tim Wolken, Executive Director, Community Services Department, and Frank McGee, Area Wildlife Manager, Colorado Parks and Wildlife.
Good morning, Commissioners. We're very pleased to have Frank with us today. He has the challenging job of overseeing wildlife management in our region. We work with Frank on a regular basis on county park property and other property within the county as well on wildlife management issues, and greatly appreciate their help. Frank's going to give you an overview of what they've accomplished this year, some of their objectives upcoming, and happy to address any questions you may have. So at the point, I'll turn it over to Frank.
Thank you very much, President Glenn, Commissioners. Thanks for having me. So just briefly, just wanted to run through a couple things. This is our agency's mission. I won't get into it in detail other than to say that we're responsible for managing the state's wildlife and state parks. We have 41 state parks, 340 some state wildlife areas. We manage over 960 species of wildlife. And the resources we manage bring in $4.7 billion a year for our state and create something like 33,000 jobs. Also briefly, just want to let you know that unlike most government agencies you're familiar with, we don't receive general funding from taxes. We are primarily funded by our users, so hunters and anglers buy fishing and licenses, hunting licenses, park passes, and then there's an excise sales tax on hunting and fishing equipment. So briefly, this is the area that I'm responsible for. It includes El Paso County, but it's basically everything from Teller County out to the Kansas state line. And we've got 8 district wildlife managers to help cover this area. This map's a little out of date. We do have that 284 district filled now. That officer is Corey Adler. So briefly, I just wanted to kind of give you guys some information about what we've been doing, and we've been getting a lot of calls from citizens of the county that have concerns about urban wildlife issues. This is a moose that was hanging out in Manitou Springs when I first got here. She hung out for about a month before we decided to go ahead and move her to more appropriate habitat. But we got together with all the different agencies and organizations that were interested in urban wildlife issues and tried to bring them all together to the table. We asked them what were some of the issues that they were concerned about that we needed to be looking at or addressing. And then we went out to the public and had some public meetings and asked same thing. What are the issues that people are concerned about and how would they like us to address them? And I've got a lot of that public input, and now I'm kind of at the stage where I need to be talking to you all and kind of asking you what, if anything, you want to do with that information. So that's kind of where we're at. Briefly, just as based on what we went out and talked about, this is an elk that was stuck in a soccer net on the Air Force Academy a couple of weeks ago. What we heard from the public was that the #1 issue they were concerned about was the overabundance of urban deer. This is primarily an issue on the western side of the county. After that, their next biggest concern was habitat and habitat fragmentation, loss of habitat for wildlife. People were concerned about predators living in town, essentially, and the risk that posed to people and pets. The next issue that they were concerned about was rehabilitation, and I'll talk about that in more detail later, but basically animals that are injured or orphaned. And then bears and urban bears, and then a variety of other issues. So I'm going to talk to you briefly today about 3 of those, deer, rehabilitation, and bears, and then open it up for any questions you might have. So we have a lot of deer in town. On the west side of town, we have something like 20 deer per square mile, which is a much higher rate than you would see, for example, in the mountains. When asked what the public would like to do about that and presented with a bunch of different options, these are the kind of things that they supported. The one that they are predominantly interested in was urban hunting, and we're also having that conversation with the city. And there's also some other things up there that we can go into more detail if you are interested or have time. This is a buck that from this year, of course, you can see it has Christmas lights tangled up in its antlers. It's a pretty common thing around here. I just wanted to show you this map briefly because it illustrates that there are county lands that get right into the middle of town. And so, you know, the interplay of those county lands with whatever the city decides to do may be important in trying to manage those deer in town. Bears, this has been kind of a horrific year for bears. The west side of Colorado Springs, again, and El Paso County has a lot of oak brush, which would normally be very good bear habitat, but of course it's right in the middle of town in this case. We had a natural food failure this year where we had a late frost, which basically eliminated all the natural foods that bears would normally eat, which resulted in a higher than normal number of bears in town. So this is a picture of a cub that we had to move out of town this year. It's also a picture of a bear-proof trash container that I wanted to show you all. We're talking to City of Colorado Springs right now. City of Manitou Springs just passed an ordinance requiring people to secure their trash. We know from a lot of research that's been done that that is the #1 way to reduce conflicts with bears and people, is simply locking up the trash. This is a great example of a trash container that is bear resistant. Unfortunately, if you look very carefully though, you'll also notice that there is no bar to lock that particular container. So while it's a good container, it's not being used in the way that it should be. But this is from an apartment complex where we had a sow and 3 cubs in the middle of it this year. Briefly, this is just a map of kind of the last couple of years and some of the bear conflicts we've had here in town. As you can see, they're mostly concentrated on the western part of the county in city limits, essentially. The last issue I wanted to bring before you today is about rehabilitation. So essentially, rehabilitation is working with injured or orphaned animals, and they become injured or orphaned commonly because of a person. They get hit by a car, and then they're injured, or doe is hit by a car and the fawn is orphaned or something like that. So these are a number of animals from this year that we have taken to rehabilitators. We have 9 bears from El Paso County at a rehabilitator this year. So there's a lot of, the other important thing to know about rehabilitation is that's an activity that is licensed by the state, so we regulate it and make sure those animals are well cared for. The purpose of rehabilitation is to re-release those animals into the wild, but we don't have the funding to pay for that. So most of the rehabilitation that is done by volunteers and through private donations. We have been working with Tim Wolken and the county and a variety of rehabilitators from El Paso County to look at whether or not we could work on a private-public partnership where a rehabilitation center could be incorporated into a future county nature center. And I just wanted to give you some pictures of one such facility that is currently operating. This is from the state of Ohio, where Lake County has attached to one of their nature centers a wildlife rehabilitation center. So that bottom right picture is a picture of some of the enclosures where people are allowed to go and look and learn about the area's wildlife. And then the other 2 pictures are of county employees doing educational programs to children and kind of teaching them about wildlife. So that's an opportunity that I think, that El Paso County could certainly take advantage of, and there's definitely a need for. A lot of our rehabilitators are starting to get to the point where they can no longer afford to do the work, and we've recently had the Ellicott Wildlife Center closed down. And so the alternative, unfortunately, when we don't have a rehabilitator that can take one of those animals, is that they have to be euthanized. And we would certainly like to see them have a chance of getting back out in the wild. So with that, I will take any questions. Probably your first question is what's going on in that picture. And that's actually me putting bears into an artificial den that we build. So we take bears to a rehabilitator, and after they've been fattened up for a period, they're released into an artificial den. They wake up in the wild and then hopefully go back to eating natural foods.
Oh, wait a minute. You have your head in the snow in a den with bears inside.
Correct, yes.
Just wanted to clarify that. Okay.
Questions?
I got
Commissioner Waller.
Thank you. I'm curious to know about trends in populations with both bear and deer. Are they up, down, staying the same, or where are we in terms of the populations?
So it's a complicated question to answer. So statewide, deer populations are actually down. Here locally, deer populations are very high. So I mentioned that we have 20 deer per square mile within city limits of Colorado Springs. On the Air Force Academy, for example, we have about 7 deer per square mile. In the mountains west of Colorado Springs, we're in the 2 to 3 deer per square mile. And on the western slope in particular, there are places where deer populations are not doing well, and they're in decline for a variety of reasons. Here locally, however, we have very high populations.
So why do they end up in town then?
So there's a lot of people, you've probably heard, well, the deer were here first. Well, there were some deer here first, but the number of deer that we have now is kind of a direct result of the fact that we water our groceries and Mother Nature doesn't. So you have landscaping around your house, you have irrigation for that landscaping. It grows a lot of vegetation that the deer like to eat. And those things are not available to the deer in a wildland setting, at least not at the same levels that they are here in town. So that's part of what leads to the higher numbers of animals. Also, predators of deer do come into town. So we do have mountain lions preying on our deer in town, but they're also, they're still shy of people, and so they don't come into town in the same way that they would in other places.
And what about bear populations?
So again, bear populations we think are very high. They're a little bit harder to study, but we think we have something like 20,000 deer in the state, or excuse me, 20,000 bears in the state. And we're in the midst of a pretty bad food failure. So food failures used to happen every 10 years, every 5 years. They seem to be happening more often now. If you remember this year, we had a very warm spring followed by a hard freeze on Mother's Day. And so the things that those bears would normally eat aren't very available. And so I think the reason we're having so many issues is not so much a function of too many bears, it's too many bears in the wrong places.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you. So in terms of other areas having not enough deer, not necessarily not enough deer, less deer, do they want deer? I mean, would there be like a relocation project? And then if we can go back a couple slides where you had some of the options, what is the cost option or the cost variance between those options available to whether it's us or the state? And is there a recommended method that fits within the cost?
Sure. So I didn't bring it with me today, but I can go in a lot more detail on all of these. Yes, there are some places that would love to have more deer. The issue with trapping and moving deer, there's 2 issues. One issue is that deer, most deer in the state are migratory. They have a summer range and a winter range. And so in the summer, they are in higher elevations and eating food, and then when winter comes, they go to lower elevations where they find some food and stay away from predators and that sort of thing. The deer that we have in town, we actually have studied them. They're non-migratory. So part of the problem is if you take one of our deer here and move it somewhere else, it may not know where to find food. It may not know how to migrate. So some of those deer don't survive. Traditionally, something like 50% of the deer that you try to move make it in other relocation efforts. The other issue with moving deer is disease. So we have some disease in Colorado. The one of the biggest concern is chronic wasting disease. So chronic wasting disease is very similar to mad cow disease. It's a fatal neurological disease that eventually kills the animals. Because we don't have hunting within town, most of the disease surveillance we do right now is by testing animals harvested by hunters. So we don't have a very good handle on what the disease levels are like in town. However, we do know on Fort Carson, for example, just south of town, we have some of the highest rates of infection of chronic wasting disease anywhere in the state, somewhere like 25%. So we would be hesitant, probably would not move deer from an area that could have chronic wasting disease to an area that currently does not. We would not want to introduce that disease. And unfortunately, right now, the best way to test for chronic wasting disease, the animal has to be deceased. We have to test lymph nodes and brain stems and things like that. So there are issues, and there is, of course, cost. Some of the things on here, birth control, surgical sterilization, there's very high costs for those kinds of things. Generally, the public is pretty supportive of them. The big issue, of course, besides cost, is their effectiveness. To date, no community has really effectively managed their deer through these kind of non-lethal means. You have to get such a high percentage of the animals in order to make it work that in a wild population, that's difficult to do. I can provide more information. I'll get a packet to Tim and then have it to you all with kind of a spreadsheet of all the different options and the cost and those kind of things.
Because I do think that probably the best information that I can use is the costs associated
Sure.
with each of these, and then that comment about effectiveness
Right.
for each of them.
So
as you
yeah,
just
and
highlighted.
the costs vary from free, for example, with hunting, you can essentially charge people for the privilege of participating to $1,000 per animal when you're trying to trap and move an animal.
Commissioner Vanderwerf.
Thank you, Mr. President. I live in a part of town where there's a lot of deer. In fact, driving into work today, I had to stop and wait for a herd of does, 8 of them, to walk across the street. So I think there's probably 100 or more in the square mile that I live, or certainly they are there. So, yeah, I'm being told it's just because they like me or something like that. But I do have a question about the urban hunting. Seriously, what would an urban hunting program look like, and where would you do that?
Sure. So, and I didn't really get into very much detail, but one of the reasons people are so concerned about deer is not just the property damage things. We hear complaints about people from landscaping and gardens and things like that, but also the concern is safety and collisions with cars and that sort of thing as well. So that's partly why this is such an issue for some of your constituents. What urban deer hunting could look like a variety of things. What it won't look like is people wandering in your neighborhood with high-powered rifles shooting at deer in your yard.
I'm very glad to hear that, yes.
And it's entirely up to, both the city and the county if you guys decide to look into this. I would say, obviously, in the majority of the county, of course, hunting already happens. In the unincorporated parts of the county, it's permitted and it happens on a regular basis. Urban hunts, a lot of communities, and this is an issue that's been dealt with across this country and primarily in the east where we have more white-tailed deer. Pretty much every community that you can think of that has done this has done it in a slightly different way. So some communities will require archery only is a pretty common requirement. Some communities will require people to hunt from an elevated platform, so they have to use a tree stand so that they're shooting directly down at the ground. A lot of communities will make people take a further safety class. So anyone who hunts in Colorado is required to take hunter education, but some communities will have kind of a more in-depth class that's specific to their urban hunt. Some communities only allow hunting on private property. Some communities require a minimum property size. Some communities require people to register their property to participate. Some communities only hunt on parks and open space. Sometimes those are done usually during the winter. Commonly, they will close the park for a day or two while they're conducting their hunt. Some communities require a proficiency test. So in other words, if you're requiring them to use archery equipment, you require that they demonstrate that they can hit what they're shooting at, essentially. So there are a variety of things other places have tried. And to date, there haven't really been any issues with regard to safety or anything like that. So there's a lot of ways that it can be done where you can effectively manage deer and also not have conflicts. I would point out that we do have essentially an urban deer hunt going on the Air Force Academy that started back in the 80s. We used to have something like 175 collisions per year on the Air Force Academy. After hunting, we now have something like 10 to 20 deer collisions per year on the Air Force Academy. And there are still lots of deer on the Air Force Academy. It's just the density of deer is much lower than it used to be.
Thank you. As a quick follow-up, in keeping also with Commissioner Gonzalez's request about, what might look right and what's the value and what's the cost, I just have to imagine a major component of that is going to be this urban hunting component because of what you have here as far as how citizens responded to it. Do you have an intention of proposing something like that here?
Well, for sure, we're talking right now with the city of Colorado Springs. I talked to city council back in July, and we have kind of a task force that's looking at that issue right now. And one of the things that they are seriously considering is an urban deer hunt. And I think, I was approached by former Commissioner Sally Clark and asked, why hadn't I come and talked to the county yet? And part of it was just bandwidth. I approached the city first because most of these issues are within city limits. But she correctly pointed out that there are county parks that are in city limits, that, if we were to try to control deer on city property or on private property, that, those county properties could become a refuge and, would probably need to be included in something like that.
Right. And one last quick question. If, kind of thinking in regard to that, with regard to maybe a county contribution to this issue, if we were to thin through hunting or some other process, deer herds that are outside the city limits in county jurisdiction, does that lend itself for then these deer possibly then migrating out because there's less competition in these peripheral areas of the city? Or is, I don't know if that would be effective or not.
Yeah, I think that, we won't really know until we get started with some kind of a program, but I think one of the things that is likely to happen is if deer in town or close to town start feeling hunting pressure, we'll probably see a return to more kind of normal deer behavior where they'll have more fear of people. They may move and migrate more because they don't have that same level of comfort that they do now. And to be sure, that level of comfort that they have now is not really a good thing. We have had people injured by deer. Just about a month ago, we had about a 72-year-old woman in the Black Forest area who was badly gored by a deer. So if we want to have, and we do as an agency, right, our mission is to have wildlife and to manage wildlife, but we want them to be wild animals. And some of the deer in town, because they're being fed or because, they're a little too comfortable around people. And I think we may see some more normal deer behavior very early on, even before we, have a significant impact on densities.
Thank you.
Commissioner Littleton.
Thank you. I have Christian has a few pictures of my backyard a couple of days ago. I regularly, throughout the summer, had 3 trophy bucks in my backyard on a consistent basis. And that anybody was like, my gosh, hunters were appalled that I had them in my backyard. They wanted to know if they could come visit, other than being upside down. So anyways, I have a nice berm already in the back. So I don't know about the urban deer hunting. I would have trouble taking care of Bambi in my backyard. But anyways, it is a problem and it's a concern. You can see on a couple of these, whoops, how close they come to the house. And on a regular basis, I'll during the summer just be sitting out there and they'll like round the corner and there they are. I didn't know they would hurt people, so I'll be a little more cautious now when some of those bucks are sitting in my backyard or front yard. They're on a regular basis. I have to wait for them to get out of my driveway so I can pull up into my garage and. So anyways, those are the guys that visit my backyard on a regular basis. So it is a concern. Guys and gals, I guess I should say.
Any other questions? Wow. Well, thank you very much for the update. And please come back on a regular basis because this is something that really has a broad interest in the community.
Thank you very much for your time.
Okay. Tim, anything else? Okay, great. All right. Any other community service organization reports? Okay, seeing none. Item 7.
Item 7 is the consent calendar, 7A through D, excluding 7B. Is there anyone present this morning who would like to comment on a matter on today's consent calendar?
Okay, seeing none, I will entertain a motion.
Move approval.
Second?
Call the roll. Commissioner Littleton.
Aye.